Welcome to the real Mr. Beer, Mr. Beer's own channel. We're here to provide you homebrewing guidance and tips, equipping you with all sorts of beer knowledge. My name is Tim Falk. I'm the customer service manager here at Mr. Beer. If you've ever called us or chatted in or emailed, there's a fair chance we've talked. Today we're going to be brewing our That Voodoo That You Do Ale. It is one of our most popular recipes. It's got a 4.7 star review on our website, which is obviously pretty good. I always call this recipe our biggest crowd pleaser. Everybody likes it. No one has anything bad to say about it. It's an amber ale, so we're going to talk a bit about amber ale style and history. It incorporates some brown sugar, so we're going to talk about what kind of sugars you might use when you're brewing in wine. This beer has an ABV, or alcohol by volume, of 7.4%, which is definitely on the high end. But we've talked about conditioning in the past and how high ABV beers can require more conditioning. This is one of the ones that I don't think needs to sit that long in the bottles, considering how much alcohol it's got in it. It's not terribly boozy either for 7%. The SRM, or standard reference method, is 19. This refers to the color of the beer. It's a scale of 40, so 19's kind of in the middle. As you can probably imagine, amber ales are sort of the halfway point between real light beers and real dark ones. It's got 30 IBUs, IBUs being international bitterness units, how bitter the beer is. That's on a scale of 100, so 30 IBUs is not a terribly bitter beer, as we'll come to see. That is not very unusual for the style. What sets this amber ale apart from other ones that you might find is that we're going to go ahead and make a wheat malt addition, and we're also going to add a little bit of brown sugar to add a bit to the ABV and get some molasses notes. This recipe includes 1 can of Bewitched Amber Ale. That's going to be our amber ale malt. If you order this, you're also going to get one of our golden LMEs. LME stands for liquid malt extract. It's the same stuff that's in the cans, but without the hops. It adds alcohol, body, and head retention to your beer. It can also add flavor, color, and aroma, depending on how you do it. This is where we get our wheat malt. This is a much simpler way to add wheat malt to your beer than using actual malt and actual wheat. For this recipe, this is one of our recipes where we're going to have you, the brewer, go ahead and provide an ingredient. We typically only do this with stuff that you can find at any grocery store. In this case, it's brown sugar. Sometimes it's honey. Sometimes it's mulling spices or coriander. Sometimes it's fresh fruit, fresh citrus zest. It kind of just depends. Good names absolutely make the beer taste better, as do cool labels. Everybody knows that. So, like with every recipe, we're going to sanitize first. We do this because beer is a very attractive environment for bacteria and mold and wild yeast. Now, none of this is the kind of stuff that's going to make anybody sick. That kind of microorganism doesn't do very well in beer. But the kind of stuff that does grow in beer can cause off flavors to develop, which we're obviously trying to avoid. So it's very important that everything that's going to touch the beer is sanitized. Now, while I'm putting the spigot into the fermenter the way I usually do, which we're going to show you over here, I'd like to talk about sugar. So, as you may have read or heard, the short story is that the more sugar is in your beer, the higher the ABV is. And that is technically true. However, not all sugars are created equal. And if you use too much of the wrong kind of sugar, you can get off flavors in your beer, specifically a cidery off flavor. Now, for our purposes today, you can broadly break sugars into 2 groups: malt-based sugars and non-malt-based sugars. Now, malt-based sugars, the only limit to how much you can use is the alcohol tolerance of your yeast, and most yeast are going to have a tolerance of around 9 or 10%. So these, for for beginner purposes, are going to be our malt-based sugars. Pretty much anything that isn't one of these two or dry malt extract is going to be a non-malt sugar. Now, as far as the actual chemical names of all these sugars, there's a whole bunch of them and I won't bore you. But pretty much anything that isn't one of those malt sources, you're not going to want it to make up more than about a fourth of your ABV. I know that sounds like kind of a weird way to think about it, but I just find it to be the simplest. So off the top of my head, this cup of brown sugar we're going to add to the beer is not going to add more than about 1% to our ABV. So 1 out of 7.4 is way less than a third or a fourth, so we're going to be just fine here. That same rule is going to apply whether you're adding fruit, honey, brown sugar. Now, the thing of it is, you're really going to be adding this stuff more for the sake of flavor than for alcohol in our beers. The honey and brown sugar and fruit and all that kind of stuff has sugar in it, but those aren't the only things that give it the flavor and aroma. So the yeast is going to eat up all that sugar. So adding stuff like that doesn't make your beer sweeter, it actually makes it drier. You're not really going to have any good reason ever to use plain table sugar in your beer. It will give it a higher ABV, but it will also make it not taste very good. Like I said, it gives it a cidery off flavor. So you're going to want to chase flavor rather than ABV. Another very common non-malt sugar you're going to run into is our booster, which has dextrose, maltose, and a number of other sugars. That one's real simple. Just don't add more than 2 bags in a 2-gallon batch, and that's all you have to remember about the booster. Alright, so now that our fermenter is assembled, we're going to go ahead and fill it with a gallon of water. I would mention as kind of a special exception to my plain sugar rule. There is a style of beer called Belgian ales that use a special kind of yeast that don't really have that the same problem with the off flavor that other yeasts do. But for a Belgian ale, you're typically going to use a special kind of sugar called candy sugar. It's candy with an I. That's often derived from beets. You can get it in syrup form or in powder form. That's kind of going a bit beyond what we're usually going to cover in our beginner stream, but just for your general knowledge, in case it ever comes up, Belgian ales are a bit of an exception to the rule. We're going to go ahead and add half a packet of our no-rinse cleanser. While we're sanitizing our beer, we're also kind of checking the fermenter for leaks at the same time to make sure we assembled it correctly. Just going to mix that in a little bit. And I'm also going to go ahead and take our can of extract and our pouch of LME, and I'm going to soak them in some hot water. Going to do that because they have a real thick consistency, and heating them up a bit is going to help you get all your malt out of the containers. I'm also prying the plastic cap off this can and taking out the gold packet of yeast. This is the yeast we're going to use for this batch. I'll talk about some different yeasts you could use at the end. Since this particular beer is going to be a bit on the malty side by design, we're not going to have any hop additions. Like we're going to go over later, you definitely can have a hoppy amber ale. That's kind of one of the, it's not quite a defining trait of the style, but it's a very common characteristic of them. I'm going to take the lid and put it on my LBK so I can go ahead and splash around the sanitizing solution and make sure all the surfaces in here have touched it. You're going to see a little bit of water dripping out of the top. Our kegs are designed like that on purpose. You'll note that our kits don't have an airlock like a lot of other kits do. That's because on the threads where the lid screws on, there are 2 little notches that let carbon dioxide out, carbon dioxide produced by fermentation. And they're small enough that the CO2 has enough force that it also keeps out all that bacteria, wild yeast, mold that we were trying to avoid with this sanitizing solution. We're getting a bit of our sanitizing solution here in a mixing bowl so we can go ahead and sanitize the instruments we're going to brew with. Like I said, anything that's going to touch the beer has to be sanitized. Like I was saying, it's pretty common to find hoppier amber ales than this, but in this particular recipe, that Voodoo that you do, the molasses notes we're going to get from the brown sugar and the wheat malt are kind of more the star of the show than hops would be. I have tried variations of this recipe with hop additions, and if anything, they were kind of just a distraction. I didn't really like how it turned out. Okay, so everything that touches our beer has touched our sanitizing solution. I'm going to go ahead and take 4 cups of filtered water and bring it up to a boil. Now, for your beer, you can use pretty much any kind of water except distilled or reverse osmosis water. The reason you're going to want to steer clear of those is because yeast is a living thing, just like us, and just like us, it needs some minerals to get by. Those minerals are present in spring water, tap water, filtered water, pretty much everything except those 2, reverse osmosis and distilled. So we usually steer clear of those. Tap water can also be chlorinated to a degree that can cause off flavors in your beer, give it kind of a plasticky or medicine-y taste. So I typically recommend just getting those big jugs of filtered water you get at the grocery store that go for less than $1 typically. While our water heats up, I'm going to go ahead and sanitize my funnel. I find that using a funnel kind of just tidies up the whole process a bit. It's a small investment that makes brew day a whole lot easier. Our witch's flight is very similar to this recipe. I was actually there. I was there, man, for the founding of that recipe. It was actually how Josh taught me how to brew, how our recipes work. That fateful August day in 2015. Now, I'm also going to recommend that you refrigerate the water that you're going to use for your beer. Again, rule of thumb is that if it tastes good to drink for the water, if it tastes good to drink, then it's going to taste good to brew with. I'm going to recommend that you refrigerate that water. The reason is that when we pitch our yeast, which is kind of fancy talk for add our yeast into our wort, we want that wort to be at around 65 degrees Fahrenheit. If it is too much warmer than that, you're going to get an off flavor. As you can see, I am peeling the label off the can. That's just because every now and again you'll get a piece of label dropping into your wort, and that is obviously something we want to avoid. I actually failed to take my own advice here, almost. I usually recommend adding your brown sugar in before you heat up the water. That's because it mixes more easily with cold water than with hot. However, I was on a roll, and I forgot to add my 1 cup of packed brown sugar, so I'm going to go ahead and add it now before it's too late. Well, let me rephrase that. It wouldn't be too late if I waited until the water was hot, but it might be a little more difficult to mix in. So we're just going to stir that in. Now, once you add your yeast, it's probably going to be about 24 hours before you start seeing much foam. If you want to get real technical, foam that is on your beer is called krausen. High krausen is the point at which your beer is going to have the most foam. That's typically within 3 to 5 days after you pitch. Now, some beers are going to have lots and lots of foam the whole time. Some are barely going to have any the whole time. Some of them will start off with a lot and then it'll taper off. Some will start really slow and then there'll be a whole bunch by the ends. The amount of foam is not a very good indication of whether fermentation is happening. A much better indication is whether the trub or sediment is collecting at the bottom of your fermenter. You might need a flashlight to go ahead and look through your fermenter and kind of take a look and see if you can see it falling down there. But if you see a layer of white stuff at the bottom of your fermenter, that's good news. Gosh, you guys sure are quiet on the chat today. I must be doing a really good job if there are no questions at this point. For this beer, our fermentation is going to be about 21 days. That's what we're recommending for all our beers. Now, conventional wisdom has been you can ferment your beer in as little as 10 to 14 days. And while the sugar conversion into alcohol might be finished at that point, your yeast is still active. It's kind of eaten up some of the byproducts of fermentation that can leave your beer with off flavors. You guys might be noticing off flavors are a recurring theme in this discussion. What we are doing today has consequences 6 weeks down the road. If we make a mistake here, we're not going to know about it for like a month and a half when we're trying to show off our beer to everybody, and then everybody tastes it and they look at it kind of funny and they go, ugh, what's this? It'll be like what happens about half the time when I reveal my beers at our tastings here at the office. So if you pay close attention to your procedure, if you get all your stuff ready ahead of time, and if you're prepared, and if you've done all your research, and of course watched our beginner Twitch stream starring me, your beer will have much higher odds of success. As Josh points out, if you're doing a real big high gravity beer that's going to have a lot of sugar in it, especially beer that's going to have a lot of simple sugar in it, simple sugars like say fruit, honey, or brown sugar, like we're using today, you can expect your beer to have a lot of foam really fast. So we're going to recommend keeping this beer on the lower end of our recommended temperature range for this one, which is 65 to 75 Fahrenheit. If you want to raise the IBU of this beer, you would need to do a hop boil, and I have great news. Josh is going to talk all about hop boils tomorrow. It's more of an intermediate topic, so I'm not going to go into it too much today, but if you want to know more about how to make your beer more bitter or add hop flavor or aroma to it, tomorrow will be a great show to watch. You don't want to miss it. And these are getting archived for later viewing on our Twitch as well. Let's see. Kind of just waiting for our water to boil. The waiting is the hardest part. So I'm going to go ahead and grab our LME, our liquid malt extract, over here too. Now again, for your malt-based sugars, the only limit is going to be the ABV of your beer, or rather the ABV tolerance of your yeast, which again is usually going to be around about 9 to 10%. When I said 3.5, I was thinking of our cans for some reason. Our standard cans have an ABV of 3.5% when you do them by themselves. These craft cans are a little bit larger. They have an ABV of about 5% if you do them by themselves. And we also used to have some seasonal beers that we still have a few of up on our website. We are discontinuing that series. But those had an ABV of about 6.5% by themselves. So now that our water is boiling, we're going to go ahead and add our hopped malt extract. It does not matter if you stir the water while it's boiling. The brown sugar will dissolve pretty much on its own. I stirred it in with a whisk a little bit, like you might remember. Right now I'm pouring in my malt extract, and I am scraping the sides of the can as well as I am able, because the more of this extract that we leave behind, the more flavor, color, aroma, body, head retention, and ABV we are leaving behind. If you don't scrape out your can real well, you're not going to be getting the most out of your refill. As you can see, this can be kind of a messy procedure. We got some dripping off the sides here. So a bigger pot is usually a little better, especially I find with the craft and the seasonal cans. Trying to be real thorough here, but we do have a schedule to keep after all. We're all busy people. So we're going to go ahead and call that good. I know some of you probably just saw that can shot and cringed and got mad at me for being wasteful. But you know, we have a bunch of other stuff to do still. We're not even close to done. When will I use a conical fermenter? You know, I'm actually not sure that I will use a conical fermenter here on our beginner stream, because the purposes of the conical fermenter are geared a bit more towards our intermediate and advanced brewers. So that is probably going to be something that Josh ends up handling. Leaving your spatula in the pot while you pour in your LME is kind of a risky move, because on the one hand, you don't have to worry about setting it down somewhere dirty, but on the other hand, it slips all over the place, and you might drizzle LME all over it, and put it away with LME all over it, and then get in trouble with Josh for putting away dirty utensils. Your experience might vary. What is what? Are we talking about the stuff I'm adding right now? This is liquid malt extract that I'm adding right now. It's the same stuff that's in the cans except without the hops. Now, remember, beers tend to have a balance between malty and hoppy, and since we are adding malt, it is going to make our beer more on the malty side. For the style of beer that we're making today, that's perfectly appropriate. This induction burner we're using is a precision induction cooktop. It's very nice. We also got some new ones that I'd love to show you guys sometimes. They're a little bigger and a lot faster. I'm just stirring it up a little bit so there's not too much malt sticking to the bottom of the pot. Because like I said, the more we leave behind, the less we're getting out of our beer. So now that I'm satisfied that it's pretty well mixed up, I'm going to go ahead and add my first gallon of cold water to my fermenter, filling it up to the number 1 or 4 quart line. Oh my gosh, we're splashing everywhere. Now, since this beer doesn't have a hop addition, we don't have to worry about the hop sack clogging up our funnel. If we were using a hop sack, well, I wouldn't use a hop sack. I put my hops in naked to avoid the whole problem. But if you were using a hop sack at this point, you might want to consider having some tongs handy so you can kind of move it out of the way. I would entertain the idea of doing a root beer kit one of these days. I know it's not quite what we usually do, but it is a very popular product, so it's certainly worth mentioning. I'm going to go ahead and want 2 hands for this. And we're pouring our hot wort into our fermenter. Scrape that out a little bit. I know you guys can't really see, but the inside of the pot is kind of coated with malt. Okay, go ahead and put this in the sink. And now we're going to go ahead and fill our fermenter up to the number 2 or 8.5 quart line. All of the refills and recipes on our website are going to produce 2 gallons of beer. or cider, unless it specifically says 6G in the name. We have like 12 of those, I think, that are 6-gallon. If you order one of those, you're going to get 3 of our 2-gallon recipes, as you can imagine. We did bring back the Winter Dark Ale. That's one of my favorite beers of ours. And people were asking us to bring it back for many years. And we finally did. This is a limited release just like last time, so as soon as it's gone, it's gone. What I'm doing right now is aerating my wort. That means I am stirring it with a whisk for about a minute or so. Get it good and foamy. Also, just like us, in addition to the mineral thing, yeast need oxygen to do their thing. So at this point, getting a little oxygen in our wort is a good thing. After this point, exposing our beer to oxygen will be a bad thing and can cause off flavors, which again we are trying to avoid. Okay, there we go. Since it's such a small batch, you don't need to worry a whole lot about aerating it a whole bunch, but it's always good to do. Now we're going to pitch our yeast. For this beer, we're going to use our standard Cooper's yeast. In my experimenting, I found that I also liked using SO4, Safale SO4, which is an English ale yeast that is very popular for this kind of beer. Now that our yeast is pitched and I didn't drop the lid on the floor, I'm going to go ahead and screw it on top of the fermenter, making sure it's threaded. I don't think I was scratching the LBK, as I may have gone over before. Using metal instruments in an LBK can be kind of a crapshoot because the LBK is plastic and easily scratched. And these scratches can harbor the kind of bacteria and yeast we're trying to keep out of our fermenter. So I am trying to be careful not to hit the sides anyway. But now we're going to go ahead and talk a little bit about amber ales. American amber ales specifically, which are style 19A as an alpha, according to BJCP standards, which is again the guidelines we use to determine beer styles. It is, as the name suggests, an amber-colored hoppy beer of moderate strength with caramel malt flavor. It can be pretty widely varied from fairly malty, like the beer we just made, to aggressively hoppy. On the aggressively hoppy side, there gets to be kind of a fine line between red IPA and amber ale, which can also be called a red ale. It can be aggressively hoppy, but the hops must complement the malt. So if you use some kind of hops that doesn't work well with caramel malts, it's not going to be very good. The aroma is supposed to have low to moderate hoppiness. New World hop varieties, kind of like the sort you would find in an IPA, are common and popular in these beers. Citrusy hops are common but not required, so if you were thinking about a hop addition to an amber ale, you might want to think about Falconer's Flight, Cascade, Citra maybe, something like that. They may have yeast esters, as we went over in the wheat beer episode. Esters are a compound produced by yeast that have a really kind of fruity aroma or flavor typically. They're produced by ale yeast. Since this is an ale, it wouldn't necessarily be inappropriate to have some yeasty esters, but you don't have to. The color is going to be amber to coppery brown, which again is coming from the caramel malts. The appearance is that, like I said, amber to coppery brown in color. It's going to have a large off-white head with good head retention. When you pour it, it's going to look real pretty. It's usually going to be clear, but there are hazy varieties that typically get that haziness from being dry hopped. The flavor is moderately to highly hoppy. This is kind of moderate beer. It's, again, I think off the top of my head, it's 30 IBU, which is not unhoppy, but it's definitely on the malty side. It's going to be moderately to strongly malty, usually with initially malty sweetness followed by moderate caramel flavor. The bitterness is usually balanced and supportive. If it's crazy bitter, it's a red IPA, not an amber ale. The mouthfeel is going to be medium to medium full-bodied with medium to high carbonation. It's going to have a smooth finish with no astringency. Stronger versions can have alcoholic warmth, that booziness. Like I said, this particular recipe that we made today, that Voodoo that you do, considering it has a pretty high ABV of 7.4, it's not very boozy at all, and it's very smooth relatively soon for this kind of beer. History. This is actually a pretty modern style of beer. It's a modern American craft beer style that was originally a variation on pale ales. If you look at the grain bill for an amber ale from scratch, all grain, you will find it's mostly something like 2-row with a little bit of caramel malt to give it that trademark amber color. And as Josh is pointing out, caramel malts are really easy to complement with domestic hops. He likes using piney hops. Citrusy hops work well too, like I was saying. This was popularized in Northern California and the Pacific Northwest, where hoppy beers have long been popular. Kind of an interesting thing stylistically is that some darker pale ales can be the same color as some lighter amber ales. So it can be a fine line between an amber ale and a pale ale. And like I said, and like we discussed last week, there's a style of IPA with caramel malts in it called a red IPA. So it can be kind of a fine line between a red IPA and an amber ale as well. If it's like an amber ale but it's bitter, super duper bitter, then it's a red IPA. Amber ales are known more for being moderately hoppy or well balanced. Is there such thing as a red amber? Not really. Like I said, red ale and amber ale are kind of interchangeable terms. Josh loves his style nitpicks, being a licensed BJCP judge. He knows a lot more about this off the top of his head than I do. So if there is some kind of arcane, bizarre, mystical, only BJCP people know it, difference between an amber and a red, Josh will know it. I was not able to find one in any of my research. So that about wraps it up for that Voodoo that you do in amber ale. I'll go ahead and stand by for a second and see if you guys have any questions. Gosh, you guys are quiet today. But there's a lot of you watching. Don't be shy. I'm not going to reach through the computer and bite you. Probably. Alright, well, thank you guys so much for joining us. It was great brewing with you. Thanks for watching, and you can tune in next week for our intermediate cast where Josh is going to be going ahead and doing a hop boil with unhopped malt extract. Thank you so much, and I'll see you guys next time.